I wonder if anyone can tell us if we have sound on Facebook.
Well, we are live officially on all three locations. I don't know if anyone can hear what we're saying. But this is the Gunner Technology Livestream, a weekly 10-minute tech talk for non-techies and techies alike. I'm your host, Darren Merkins. With me today, President and CEO of Gunner Technology, Cody Swan. How you doing, Cody?
I am doing just fine. I'm ready for some normalcy after like long travels and Thanksgiving and all that.
Yeah, we've
jazz.
been MA for 2 weeks thanks to Thanksgiving and travel, but we'll be back now on a weekly basis. So get pumped for that. And sorry about being late. We're usually really good about being on time, but technical difficulties can't be avoided sometimes. So
it's the first episode, first day.
We'll work it out. But this is the first official episode of the Gunner Technology Livestream, and this is the first part of a 4-part series on the history of JavaScript that we're going to be doing in the month of December. So to get it kicked off, for an initial question, Cody, this is to you. What is JavaScript and where did it come from?
So JavaScript came basically from Netscape's attempt to keep up with Microsoft. For the longest time, Netscape was almost the de facto browser, web browser, that is, when in the early days of web browsers, you had this is back in like the AOL days. This is the early 90s kind of thing. And excuse me, Netscape, which later became Mozilla, was the industry standard. It actually had, for that time, a very good web browser. And Microsoft, as it often did those days, kind of piggybacked off of what other people were discovering, and basically was like, "Whoa, this web thing, this is going to be big. How do we capitalize on that?" So, kind of, Microsoft was the de facto operating system of your computer at that time, and basically, what they set off to do is become the de facto operating system for the web at that time. And so they basically kind of purchased and built Internet Explorer. So Netscape had this big competitor now in Microsoft, and they wanted to kind of triage that immediately. So they partnered with Sun Microsystems, which at the time Sun owned a very popular programming language called Java. And it was kind of, JavaScript and Java are to this day confused, and they're very different. And basically, JavaScript.
Yeah, is there any crossover at all between those two languages, Java and JavaScript?
No, other than the fact that they wanted to market them together as JavaScript being the companion language to Java, just as a marketing ploy. There's no real crossover. JavaScript is based off of 3 languages: Java, Self, and another one that I can't remember. So it's not at all like JavaScript. Matter of fact, it was called Mocha before it was called JavaScript.
And I think it was LiveScript at one point, right? Before it became JavaScript. So
LiveScript was a little bit different. It was JavaScript, but it was way ahead of its time. LiveScript was Netscape's idea to write server-side JavaScript and pump it down to the client side. So it was like the precursor in a way to Node. So it was JavaScript, but it was a failed attempt to kind of marry the front end, which is your web browser, and the back end, which is the actual server where the pages are served from.
Right. So Netscape is messing around with JavaScript, and then this is the mid-90s. And then how do we get from the mid-90s to when JavaScript really starts taking off?
Yeah, so I kind of looked ahead, and we're going to be talking about jQuery and some other frameworks, so I can kind of take us up to that time frame. So the way I kind of say it is, if you use the web as a house for an analogy, you kind of had 3 parts to the web. You had HTML and very early CSS, and again, very early JavaScript. And if you think about that as a house, you kind of have the foundation and the walls and the structure. That's your HTML. Right. The CSS is kind of the colors you paint your wall, the trim you give your doors, kind of like the visual appearance. That's CSS. And then JavaScript is like the stuff, is like the thing that makes your house work, like the electricity when you flip a switch, kind of like the hinges on the door when you open it and the door opens. It's like the movable parts.
So it's the functional component of the setup.
Yeah, exactly. And that's basically at first, JavaScript was really used for form validation, where if you were typing in a form and went to hit submit and you forgot to type in your first name, JavaScript would be like, oh, hey, you forgot to type in your first name.
Right.
And then it kind of moved into visual UI tweaks, where if you clicked a button, it would hide an element on the page. Like, if you click cancel, the little message would disappear. And the combination of that interaction, JavaScript with HTML and CSS, that was kind of called DHTML in the early days. And that was kind of like how everything interacted.
And so take people back for the early days of the web. What were websites like before JavaScript became ubiquitous?
That's like the early days, even for me. And so I do this based on memory and a little bit of research. But again, so even in the earliest time when JavaScript was used for form validation and kind of changing the structure of a page, you would have to do that on the server. So take my example of validating a form before it's submitted. The user would have to submit the form, fill out this whole big form, and then hit submit, and the whole page would submit to the server. The server would check the page, and the server would say, oh, there's a first name missing, and it would reload the page and say, hey, you forgot to put in your first name. Now, again, we're back on, this is around 56K and before times in terms of modem speed. So you think how long that would take to just validate one page and then re-render the whole page by just doing simple form validation. Same thing with hiding an element. If you wanted to hide an element, you'd have to reload the whole page to remove the element. And so things just were really slow without JavaScript.
And so is that a case of JavaScript filled the need of being able to render stuff directly on a user's computer as opposed to having to make that call all the time?
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. And it kind of just, JavaScript is a functional language in the programming paradigm, but it's also a functional language in its need. It graduated every step of the way, from form validation to visual tweaks, all the way up to like Ajax, which kind of, we can kind of get it to, but it was a case by case. It grew up on a case by case basis to fill a very specific need every single time.
And is that one of the reasons? Because I know the browser wars were one of the primary causes of all the headaches with JavaScript that came along down the line. Is that something that's always been there? The non-compatibility of the various browsers?
Yeah, it has. It's weird because Netscape, who the creator of JavaScript, worked for Netscape at that time, and as soon as Microsoft kind of got into the game and we're using JavaScript, he was kind of like, let's have standards. Let's have standards because this is going to get out of control. We're going to have Internet Explorer's version of JavaScript being different from Netscape's, and then if someone else comes in, we're going to have their version of JavaScript be different than us. It's going to be a pain in the butt because nothing's going to be standard. You're going to write JavaScript for one browser, and it's not going to work in the other. Well, Microsoft was like, yeah, okay, thanks, but we're going to kind of take it our own way, and that was the beginning of the major headaches for developers, because the common phrase was it doesn't work in IE, and so you would hear that phrase all the time. A bug would be filed saying, hey, this page doesn't work in IE. Well, that's largely because of JavaScript and to some extent CSS. But yes, it's today we don't really have to worry about that. But up until about probably 2006, 2007, 2008, you would have to, as a JavaScript developer, be aware that you were writing not just JavaScript for one browser, but for all browsers, and kind of hack your code to support various other browsers, which is just that's the impetus for why developers to this day still have a negative view of JavaScript, because they can't get over that. When in reality, most of the things that the old school developers hated about JavaScript doesn't even exist anymore.
And I guess that was just a result of Microsoft actually having the clout or the power at that point to not update their browser and say, you're going to have to work with the way it is. You're going to have to sort of appease us as opposed to the other way around, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they did have, this was part of the reason that I got slapped with an antitrust suit back in that time, is because every computer, or like I said, like 90% of computers out there, were running Microsoft running Windows Microsoft as their operating system. Windows shipped with Internet Explorer as the default web browser. Well, back then, even today, by the way, but especially back then, no one was changing their web browser. They just used what was there, and they wouldn't use Internet Explorer to go download Mozilla or go download another one. They were just using whatever was there. So yeah,
I think isn't it also the case that the government uses Internet Explorer or Windows and Internet Explorer almost across the board? So it was a huge undertaking to update these machines.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to this day, or at least up until 3 years ago, like the IRS was still using Windows XP, which was kind of version locked into Internet Explorer 7 or 8 at max.
Yeah,
so when you have large entities like the IRS, you kind of, if you work for a larger organization, you kind of have to support that, even though like 2% of your users are actually using Internet Explorer. It's an important 2%.
And I guess that's actually a pretty good segue to our next episode. So just give a little preview of jQuery and how that sort of solved these issues with needing to write a ton of different JavaScript for a ton of different browsers.
Yeah, so jQuery is interesting, and I will segue into that because I'll kind of skip over the segment war and just jump into jQuery next time. But it got to be, there was this huge need, as we said, for writing different versions for each different browser. So there was these framework wars, and the big three, actually big four. You had MooTools, Prototype, Scriptaculous, Dojo, and jQuery. And it was really tough because they were all. Dojo was actually kind of weird because Dojo ended up losing out because it was too complex. But now it's weird because React and the major frameworks that are popular today are way closer to Dojo than they were to jQuery back then. So, but you had those four, and for various reasons, they all kind of lost out to jQuery eventually. Prototype and Scriptaculous had the early lead, and then kind of fell back to jQuery as jQuery kind of just like felt more natural, and that more natural way to write JavaScript, because it was, not to get too techie, but it was chainable was the big thing for jQuery. It was chainable.
Well, if you want to hear more about jQuery, tune in next week. Next Thursday at 1 p.m. We'll actually be on time, I promise. Catch us on YouTube. We'll be on Facebook Live and Periscope every week. If you missed this episode or you just want to rewatch it or re-listen to it, check out our podcast on iTunes, blog posts on gunnertech.com. Eventually, we'll have ebooks on AWS, iBooks, and everywhere else ebooks are sold. That's going to do it for this week. We'll catch you guys next week on time. Thanks, Cody.
Yeah, man.
All right.